So this talk is about AngularJS. It's become one of my favorite MVC frameworks for JavaScript. I think it's saved my ass so many times because it's just made JavaScript development so much more enjoyable. So I'm really happy to be here in London to sort of tell you a bit more about Angular. I put a link up for the slides, but I actually don't have the slides up just yet, but I will upload them right afterwards, and I will give it to the organizers to also put it up on the site. So my name is Chen, and as you can probably tell from my accent is that I'm not from around here. I'm from Canada, so thank you very much to DevWeek for having me here today. I kind of like to say that I'm a technologist and an educator because it's a really good way of saying that I'm just a really random person. And so I don't have a title that's just like web developer. I kind of do quite a few different things. I run my own company called Karma Laboratory, and actually with Karma Laboratory, what I actually do is a lot of Arduino workshops. So I sort of teach a lot of technology skills, whether it's hardware or web development, to people who might find sort of development scary. I used to work at this place called the Canadian Film Centre. They have this little lab called the Media Lab, which was a postgraduate program where students would come in for 5 months and they would come up with these wacky ideas for art and entertainment projects. So, you know, one year I had students come through and say, I want to make an interactive movie using EEG technology, so like it's sort of like mind reading technology, I suppose. Like it listens to your brainwaves. So it's like, so they come up with these wacky ideas, and then it's up to me to help them execute on their ideas. So I do a lot of rapid prototyping with these postgraduate students. So I worked there for a bit over a year. I volunteer at an organization in Canada called Ladies Learning Code, which is a great organization that covers most of Canada, and they teach basic web programming and web design skills to women. More recently, I was working at TELUS, which is one of Canada's largest telcos. I actually have a session tomorrow just to talk about all the stuff I kind of learned from my time at TELUS, so feel free to come to that tomorrow. It's sort of at the same time slot. And right now I work with the Google Chrome DevRel team, so I work on things like HTML5 rocks or Chrome apps, and so I help sort of write technical documentation for them. And so I will caveat that, you know, I am sort of working at Google, but this talk is like not sponsored by Google at all. I just really like AngularJS. I used to be a Flash developer, so for a really, really long time, like I loved Flash and ActionScript 2, and it became ActionScript 3. Is there anyone here who was like a former Flash developer? A couple shy hands. No one wants to say that they're a Flash developer. And so I was actually making these pretty big applications in Flash. Like one of the first jobs I had when I left school was working on a really gigantic Flash app that had, you know, 50 files, and it was just like craziness. And then we sort of started moving into Flex because Flex offered us a little bit more it was a bit more programmer-like, so it had a lot more methodologies to help organize your code. And with Flex, you would also use ActionScript 3. Are there any Flex developers, former Flex developers here? Same people putting their hands up? And so it was really interesting because Flex had something in it called data binding. And it was a really interesting concept. And then when I came across Angular, I was like, wow, this is actually quite a lot. Like, there's a lot of stuff here that I learned from Flex that I can sort of translate into Angular. So nowadays, whenever it comes to writing a large application in JavaScript, I'll tend to lean towards Angular because it's such a clean MVC framework. So most of the stuff I kind of do nowadays, if it is web, it's mainly in either sort of organized with jQuery or with Angular. And so everyone's probably here because they may have heard about Angular and just like never really like got very far in it, or maybe you're coming from a different background and you just want to hear, you know, what is this Angular thing that people keep on talking about? It's becoming one of the top, you know, 10 trends on GitHub right now because it's becoming such a popular framework. So I am going to gear this talk a lot more towards like a beginner level or something where you're switching from another language. So if you're sort of like a back-end programmer, maybe you've never touched the MVC JavaScript framework before and you just want to get up to date. So I won't get into anything too intense. And so AngularJS, the best place to start is actually the AngularJS website. And it's really nice because on the Angular, oh, I actually forgot to record. Sorry. So on the Angular website, it's kind of nice because they have a few sandboxes that you can sort of play around with in here to get sort of a feel for what Angular is. And they've been working pretty hard on getting their documentation up to date and refreshed. The biggest complaint that Angular used to have is they had really bad documentation, and it's gotten really good now. And so kind of the fun thing when you kind of look at Angular's website is that when you look at, trying to figure out what is Angular, their description is that AngularJS is what HTML would have been had it been designed for building web apps. And so when you kind of think about that, it's kind of if you've been a web developer for more than 5 years, you actually carry a lot of baggage with you of how you used to do things with HTML and JavaScript. And so Angular is sort of a new take on how we might want to approach web development as if we had a better browser. So take this example. So in JavaScript, you might have a string that you store in a variable called name. If you wanted to update something in the DOM, like something in your HTML file, the old school way would be that in your HTML file you would have a div, and it would usually have some sort of ID or class to hook onto. And so in this case, I have a div, and the ID is conference. And so you would always have to kind of look up that DOM element. So you'd use something like document.getElementById and pass in the ID. And then you could use something like a inner HTML or a text content, and then you would update the name. And so it's nice because jQuery came along and it made it a lot easier to start manipulating your DOM using the sizzle selector, which is the $sign. So you still had to do the same thing. You still had to have a div with an ID of conference. And now instead of this really long ass get element by ID, you can start going $sign and then start passing in these really complex selectors. So jQuery made selecting things on your page a lot easier. And then you would use something like a .text to update the text. So then Angular comes along and says, why are we still looking up things in the DOM? It should just know. So when you want to update text in an Angular app, you just use these two curlies. So when you kind of look at that, doesn't that just kind of seem really relaxing and really pleasant to work with? And I kind of think it's actually very zen. When I really get into Angular, I feel actually very zen. So Angular is a JavaScript sort of MVC or MVVM framework. But really, if anyone's ever used Backbone, actually raise your hand if you actually have used Backbone previously. So not a lot of people, but I kind of looked at Backbone, which was it still is a very popular MVC framework. And it just seemed really complex. It seemed like you had to know quite a lot about JavaScript in order to get into it. And I was coming from an ActionScript background where it looked a lot more like Java. So for me to kind of jump into Backbone, I was kind of I don't even know what's going on here. There's just so much stuff I have to learn about JavaScript before I can even get started with Backbone. But Angular, I thought it was really interesting because it's really relaxing when you work with it because you really don't have to inherit everything. You don't have to worry too much about classes and subclasses. There's nothing to call in order to, say, initialize one of your parent controllers. And there's really no life cycle, so you don't have to worry about initializing your components or destroying them and taking care of when they disappear. Angular just sort of takes care of that for you. So really, when you kind of think about Angular, it really is just a better web browser. And this was kind of quoted by Misko Hever, who is an inventor of Angular. And if you are interested, he had a really great interview in this sort of web app magazine called Appliness. And so it's a really great magazine for just getting up to speed on interesting things going on with building web apps. And so I really like Angular because, if you're a beginner or intermediate web developer, the way that you can sort of use Angular is very declarative. So you sort of just say what you want in a lot of ways, which means that it's more readable. It helps you organize your code. Like, whenever I do stuff in jQuery, I find that, it starts off clean, and then after like a couple more like days, it just gets like unwieldy, and I'll try to make it clean again, and then it just becomes like spaghetti code. So Angular is really great because it really reinforces how you should organize your code. So your code is a lot cleaner. Angular does a lot of heavy lifting for you, so I'm going to talk about all the data binding that Angular has, and it makes you realize how much stuff was really annoying about working with the DOM before. And this could be argued, but I think Angular is actually very opinionated, which is really good if you're a beginner because you don't want to spend your time figuring out what's the best way to do something. In most cases with the Angular community, they've sort of rallied around what are some of the best practices for how you would organize your code. It fluctuates a little bit, so keep in mind that Angular is quite a new framework. It is only 2 years old, so the APIs are going to change slightly. The heart of it will still be the same, but things change a little bit. But I do find that overall, Angular, like how you work in Angular, is very opinionated, and it's much easier for someone who's new to sort of approach it and just say, okay, this is how I should use it. And then you can use it for a bit and then think about like, okay, how else can I do this? And you can sort of customize it for yourself. But when you're starting off, it's really good to have someone just tell you, this is how you should do it. And if you're more advanced, you can create a lot more complex web apps with less code. So the story that with the invention of Angular is that it was invented at Google on a product called Google Feedback. And it was an application that was getting really gigantic. I think they said it was over 100,000 lines of code. And then Misko said, I can probably rewrite this application in 2 weeks with the side project that I'm working on, which was, at that time, Angular. And so he went away, and instead of 2 weeks, it actually took him 3 weeks, but he actually took that huge code base and shrunk it down to 17,000 lines. So he essentially reduced it down under 10% of the code base. And the really interesting thing about Angular is that it's very test-driven, development-orientated. So it's really great for working with teams because when you're sort of using unit tests, you can start building Angular and everything's very modular, so it's really easy to write unit tests. So you can write Angular code with unit testing in mind. And so I can assume that there's probably some students here, or someone who might be new to web programming, or just programming. So I'm just going to do like a really quick refresher on, why model view controller is really good. And so in general, you have like a view, which is sort of your representation, how you represent your data. So typically this would be your HTML page, like your DOM. And then you have your model, which is sort of all your application data. So this is the stuff that, is like a JSON object or stuff coming back from a database. So it's all like the data. And essentially, most of the time when you're doing web applications is taking data from like a database or some sort of object, massaging it, and then turning it into something interesting that an end user can sort of use in their web browser. And in most cases, like it's really bad to couple your view and your model because you can kind of see this today where today we have like desktop applications and maybe you want to make a mobile application too. So you have two different views, but if you couple it too much to your data, then it's really hard for you to reuse your code. So in most cases, it's a really bad idea to have your view and your model talk to each other directly because it just means that you're going to have really fragile code and you can't really reuse your code very much. So then you have this controller, which essentially communicates between your view and your model. So like, for example, like someone could be using a form on your website, and that's the user input. And instead of talking to the model directly, so instead of like the view saying update the database, it needs to go through the controller first. And then it does the work of updating the model. The other way around is that when you get a result back from a REST call, instead of just updating the view directly, you're going to have a lot cleaner code if you push it through the controller first, and then you update the DOM. Meaning that when you are going to get to the point where you're going to write your desktop view and your mobile view, you just have to worry about changing the view, and you don't have to worry about changing your business logic. It keeps it very clean. So just, but in general, you just don't have your view talk to your model. And so once again, if you kind of look at the Angular source code, it does kind of say that it's actually an MVW framework. which is their way of saying it's a model view whatever framework, because there's all these sort of new formats now for model view controllers. So a really popular one is model view model, which Angular actually today looks a lot more like. But when they say model view whatever, it means, do whatever is right for your application. Don't worry too much about methodology. Like, do what's right for your application. If you are sort of a newcomer, I do recommend this book by Adi Asmani, JavaScript Design Patterns. And if you're just new to JavaScript in general, I definitely recommend just reading JavaScript, The Good Parts. Both these books have been great for me when I transitioned from ActionScript back into JavaScript. And so the really, really important thing that I felt like when I was learning MVC as sort of a new graduate was that no one really said this to me, but I realized over time that the most important takeaway you can take from learning MVC is that the model is the truth. So whenever you are trying to update something with your DOM, like you should never try to read things from your DOM and then do some business logic and then try to re-update the DOM. It should always come from one spot. It should be the single source of truth that you always go to, that your application always goes to do whatever it needs to do. And Angular is really great because it really reinforces this idea, and it makes it a lot easier to make the model the truth. So I'm going to get into that, but just as a quick overview of what I'm going to discuss today is that there's going to be some basics. I'm going to tell you how to get up and started with Angular. I'm going to talk about the very important two-way data binding. I'm going to talk about some template expressions, and then we're going to get a little bit deeper into what Angular calls directives. Angular also has ideas of controllers and what it calls a scope, and modules and dependency injection. And then I'm going to talk a bit about tooling, so things that will make you a bit more productive when you're using Angular. So there's some Chrome Dev Tool inspector tools that you can use called Batarang. There's an amazing tool called Yeoman for scaffolding out your web apps. And then some various testing tools for unit testing and functional testing. And I'm just going to tell you like the text editor plugin that I use for Sublime. And then we'll get a little bit deeper because by that time you're probably like, oh, I just want to go and play with Angular. So I'm just going to keep the going deeper part a bit lighter, but if I had to pick one thing to sort of talk about Angular would be directives and building your own directive, because there are some like weird quirks about it that take a little bit of a while to settle into your brain. And then a concept called watch and apply. So just to get started. So this is a very simpler Angular template. So when you kind of think Zen, yeah, this feels very Zen to me, where there's really not too much going on here. So if I just, I'm going to pop this open in my web browser. Okay, so this is what the application looks like. And it's very similar to what you see when you get to the Angular homepage, where when you type in here, the text automatically updates. And so when you kind of think about having to do this in some other framework or some previous old way, it would have taken you a lot more code than what you see here. Like that's all it took to make that sort of page refresh, or that DOM element refresh really quickly. So the first thing you kind of do is that you need to add the Angular framework to your web page. So you use the script tag and you add in the Angular framework. And the best way to get the Angular framework is, there's sort of two ways. The first way is you go to the Angular website, you look for this giant blue download button, and then when you click on it, you can sort of choose an option between, do you want to use a stable version, or do you want to use a bit of a newer version, or options to use a content delivery network like the Google content delivery networks. And so you can just like press download and it's going to save it to your disk, and then you just got to put it somewhere that you can reference. So the first thing is just having that Angular script. So you can load it locally or from a CDN. And it's really recommended that when you are sort of developing, just to use the unminified version, because if you start using the minified version and if you run into bugs, you're going to get these weird cryptic errors. So when you are just developing, use the unminified version, and when you're ready for production, go ahead and pop in the minified version. So to tell your page that it's an Angular application, you use what is called a directive, and I'll get into more what a directive is, but essentially you can see that it's a new attribute on the body tag, and it's just ng-app. And so you essentially kind of say, like, you know, what part of your page do you want to be an Angular application? So technically you could have several Angular applications on your page. Maybe you have a really large site that actually does have that you do actually need several applications for because they're very modular. But you can either apply your Angular application to the body. You know, if you need to, you can actually apply it to your HTML. For example, if you need to manipulate your title tags or something like that. Or if you really just have a small widget, you can add it onto a div. If you add it onto the smallest component possible, it does mean that your Angular is going to work a little bit faster because it has less DOM nodes to sort of transverse. So if you need to, put it on a smaller widget. But in most cases, I think the body tag is the best place to put it. And then you just sort of make it Angular. So there's tons of things that you can do to make it more Angular, but the first two things that you probably want to play around with is add a directive called ng model. And then you add some template expressions. So template expressions, essentially, they're just little JavaScript-like code snippets. And you're going to see them all over the place with these double curly brackets or braces. So you can use a simple variable in there, or you can actually reach into objects. And essentially, most of the time when you're going to use these double curly braces is when you're evaluating or binding to primitive values like strings, numbers, or booleans. So typically, you're not going to use these curly braces to do stuff with objects, but you might use it to use to manipulate, or sorry, to bind to stuff that are simple values in objects. Sort of in this example here. And then kind of the nice thing is that if your variable is undefined or null, Angular will just kind of skip over it and give you a blank page. So you don't have to worry about like weird stuff showing up on your page because it'll just be blank. So I'll just show you an example of it, running through a few of these. So you can see that, you know, here I'm evaluating just a string. There's other strings. You can use the curly braces to sort of do small calculations, so concatenation, or even doing arithmetic. And then if you have Boolean values, it'll print out true or false. And then if you have a value that is null, you're just going to have blank. And I'll just show you briefly what the code looks like too. Let me make this a bit bigger. So you can see it's pretty easy where, in this case, I'm just using an ng init, storing the string hello to first string, and then when I use the curly braces, the double curly braces, it just outputs the string. So Angular takes care of doing all that templating. And so whenever you see these double curly braces, you have to realize that it's only for simple values. So there is no flow control. It's not like another templating language, like I believe like Mustache might have a bit more control in terms of having ifs or conditionals. And so there is none of these when you use the curly braces. Because essentially you should be doing all your logic in the controller. So you should never be doing these in your views. So your views should be as dumb as possible. So you're never going to see logic in your double curly braces. And if you're a newcomer to Angular, this kind of tripped me up initially where I was looking at these curly braces, and I would see it used in scenarios like this where it makes a lot of sense here where you know that if I have a username and it has a value, it's just going to output it to the page. But then I would see it being used in other directives being passed in, and I was like, okay, yeah, I understand these double curly braces. But then I would start seeing these single curly braces, and I was like, oh, I don't know what's going on here. And it took me like a little while to realize that these weren't template expressions, they were actually just JavaScript or directive expressions. So when you look at this, if you're familiar with JavaScript, this is just an object literal. So it's not at all a templating thing, so don't get confused between 2 curly braces and 1 curly brace, because 2 curly braces means it's a template expression, and 1 curly brace actually means it's an object literal. So just kind of remember that in the back of your mind as you start approaching Angular. And when you do use an object literal, it's more that you're passing a value to your directive. It's not that you're trying to evaluate anything. So much like I said in this previous slide, keep your view simple and dumb. Don't put any logic into it. But when you do need a little bit more logic, you pass that logic into your directives. So let's talk about data binding. So in most cases, if you've ever used a templating language before, it's a sort of one-way data binding, where let's say you have a text field and you want the value to be someone's name, or you just want to output that person's name. So I would have a name, and I would hard code it to some value. And these are the spots that I want it to go to. And with a one-way merge, in another templating language, it would only do this merge once. So if you ever wanted to update your name, you had to go somewhere and force a refresh on your page using some more DOM utilization or some other more complex JavaScript. So the nice thing about Angular is that it uses two-way data binding. So it's the same form, and it's the same H1. And if I'm trying to get my name into these values, instead of using the value, I can use an ng model directive and pass in my a reference to my object, which is your name. So now instead of hard coding your name to some sort of string, my model becomes a single source of truth. And whenever your name changes, it automatically updates your view. So you never have to worry about re-rendering your templates, because your templates sort of are aware of what the model is, what the single source of truth is, and just updates itself. Oops. So you can see that actually this is broken right now. This is one-way data binding where it's hard-coded in the HTML and JavaScript. So this is kind of what one-way data binding, it's sort of like fake because it's still Angular, but this is sort of like one way because you initialize a value, and then you're using a value. But then when you want to use data binding, I'm just going to comment it out, and you can see that I just added an ng model in there. And if I just give this a refresh, it sort of stores your name somewhere. But it's kind of nice because when you sort of think about your model as being a single source of the truth, is that you can update your name from various other ways. So I'm going to get into what some of this other code does later. But essentially, I'm just going to add, sorry, it's a little bit low there. I added 3 new buttons there. So I can change my name from here, but I can also change it from other places. And essentially, the DOM isn't doing the work, it's the model that's doing all the work, and then Angular just sort of knows that when the model changes, that's when you update the DOM. So you never have to have your model talk to your view. And you can have values update from various events, whether it's a click event or some other JavaScript event. And so the important thing to know is that Angular actually consumes the DOM. It doesn't manipulate strings. It actually, when you say that something is an ng app, it takes that entire DOM tree, and when it needs to do things, it actually transverses that entire DOM. So that's actually what it consumes. It doesn't do string manipulation. It actually manipulates the DOM. Right now, Angular uses something called dirty checking, which essentially means that when you have values change, or it's checking if values have changed, it actually will transverse the DOM more than a few times, just to see if a value has changed, if a value is different than it was previously, and if it is different, then it will update your application. So it's something that they call dirty checking. But in the future versions of Angular, especially with Angular 2.0, there are some new features coming out built into browsers called object.observe. There's other things called mutation observers, which means that the browser does most of the work of looking at what's changing, and then it'll update Angular. So this is stuff that's coming in version like 2.0 for future browsers. But for now, your Angular application does consume the DOM and does have to sort of transverse it a few times. Oops. So those are sort of like the basics of Angular. It's just like getting started in the two-way data binding. So now let's get into some directives and some harder things. So directives. So the cool thing about Angular is that it has these things called directives, and essentially they teach DOM elements new tricks. So you can use Angular to enhance existing elements. So in this case, there's a directive called ng-class. And when is selected is true, it will actually make the class highlighted. Or you can use directives to encapsulate DOM functionality. So this is something that you might have heard as called web components. So this was pre-web components, but you can kind of see how this is a great way that when you have really complex DOM, you might have actually kind of worked on a few applications where just to make a date picker, you have all these nested divs, and then for someone else to look at your HTML, they're trying to figure out like what div is closing what div, and it gets really confusing. But if you can encapsulate all that DOM into one new tag, it makes it a lot easier for you to work with other people on your team, or even to work with designers. So syntax-wise, it can be a tag attribute. So you can see that it's like a div or an h1 or a body tag, and you can throw on directives either by passing in string values or booleans. You will see it as custom or existing HTML tags. So I showed you the date picker previously, and the interesting thing is that you can actually use Angular to what's called polyfill existing elements, meaning that the form tag, you can see that it looks exactly as an HTML form tag should look like, but when Angular comes across it, it can actually enhance it. The end user, as a developer, you don't have to know that, but Angular will actually kind of look for this form and actually enhance it slightly. And then you can use directives on classes. I won't get into too much of that today, but these are sort of the three places that you'll see directives. There is an additional comment directive, but I find that I've never ever used it. So you're going to see built-in directives. It's amazing because there are so many of them, and it will get you up and going without you having to write your own directives for quite a long time. There are a lot of event-based directives, so clicking a button, submitting a form, focus and blur when you leave a text field. They even have copy and paste events. You can use directives for manipulating your CSS, so changing a class, changing the style, whether or not you want to show or hide an element, using display none. You can use directives for control. So there's a really great one, ng repeat, that I'll show you a little bit later. You can use ifs and switch statements. And then most likely you'll find Angular really great for working with forms, and so they have quite a lot of directives for form manipulation. And if you need more, you can kind of see from the Angular website that there is quite a few when you kind of look at the sidebar here. These are all the directives that they have available. And so the name Angular came from HTML. So HTML tags have these little angle brackets. So that's kind of where the name Angular came from. And so when you sort of use a lot of Angular directives, they're namespace, meaning that you'll be able to figure out that it came from the core Angular library. So you'll see ng dash all over the place. If you don't see ng dash, it probably means that your directive came from somewhere else, or it's something that you were writing yourself. But then as you read through the documentation, you might be saying, I don't see dashes here, I see like camel case. So when you get from ng-click to this ng-click, there's a lot of normalization that happens under the hood using Angular. So essentially, directive names get automatically converted. So in your JavaScript, you're going to use camel case. So if you have a directive, then you're going to use camel case for your directive. But when you use it in HTML, because HTML is not necessarily case sensitive, so you can't use camel case in there, you want to use dashes. So like my dash directive, or you might see ng dash click. And if you're someone who's very interested in like making your application HTML5 compliant, and you need to run it through a validator, you can prefix the data dash prefix to anything, and it's just going to make it compliant. And if you're doing sort of experimental vendor-specific features, you can use the X prefix. And if you do come across really old Angular code, you might notice that it uses ng colon, or some variations of data dash ng colon, or even ng underscore. It's kind of amazing that the Angular framework actually just like sees all these and just normalizes it for you. But in most cases, use either data dash ng if you need to be compliant, or just use your directive straight up. Most modern browsers are completely fine with it. So I'm just going to show you a few examples of kind of neat ways that directives are used because they help encapsulate data or your DOM functionality. So here's, let's say it's like a really simple Angular application for data visualization. So if you've ever used the D3 visualization library, you might realize that sometimes to set up your DOM is a little bit complex. But you can actually use Angular and turn it into a directive. So in this case, they turned it into bar charts is the name of their directive. And then you can sort of pass in parameters to it. So when you look at the actual page, that's the only HTML that you see. So that was actually from this tutorial here. Let's run this in a JS fiddle. So you can see this is all you need for your HTML. I don't know if I zoom in, it probably wrecks the, let's see, going this way. So you can see that, like that's really all you need in order to get this output. Because essentially you're encapsulating all that DOM stuff into a directive, which is obviously more complex, but it makes your view a lot nicer because you can like quickly glance at your HTML and know what's going on in your page versus trying to figure out what this DOM thing is doing. And I don't know, I always look at charts for some reason, but here's another example of using Angular for data visualization, where you have a bit more complex of a component, which they call the chart -js. But in here you can see that they sort of have all these properties that you can pass in. These are kind of like parameters that you can start passing in. So it keeps your DOM really clean. And actually, I think the demo on this one's actually kind of cool. If it loads. Okay, so you can kind of see that it was using a very simple HTML directive to sort of output this. But it's kind of cool because if you go and you switch into like different views, it will update the directive parameters that you pass in, but you don't have to really change your HTML. It just kind of knows to go to the model and update your view using your various sort of like charting formats. And it's sort of like the last sort of neat example of directives, and really using directives quite a lot is there's this new framework that if you've ever taken a web app and tried to compile it down to a native application for like iOS or Android, you might notice that it kind of looks a bit maybe like too web-like. So a lot of frameworks have come out to make your application look more mobile friendly, so like bigger touch points, sliding menus. So there's this new framework called Iconic, which is built completely on Angular. So it gives you all these components like side menus and list views, and it's all built in Angular. So you can see that when you start building sort of a web application that's meant for a mobile device, you can keep your HTML quite clean because you can just use their component library. And there's a lot of applications out there too, or frameworks that wrap Twitter Bootstrap or wrap Zerb Foundation. So there's quite a few applications or frameworks out there that you could easily wrap using Angular to make it a lot cleaner to use. So let's talk about controllers and scope. So you want to get organized. So your views are for your HTML output. Your directors are for your DOM manipulation. And so then controllers are your business logic. So let's say that we're going to make a bug tracker app. So the features of this app is that it's going to tell you how many days you've gone since you found a bug. There's a button that you can click to say that you haven't found a bug today, so it's going to increment a counter. And sadly, if you did find a bug, it's going to reset your counter for you. So very simple bug tracker app. So here's my view. It's a very dumb view. I simplified it a bit for the slides, but I'm just going to open up the code too. So you can see that, my view is pretty dumb. It doesn't do very much in here. And in terms of Angular things, I have a template expression here, but nothing else yet. So when I actually do run this, it doesn't work. So there's, my counter is null or undefined, so it's just going to show me a blank, which is nice because it's not going to look bad to the end user. My buttons don't work. But, that's my views. Keep it, nice and simple. And so then I can start adding logic. And I guess, if you're starting, you might want to quickly see if it works by putting some logic in your view. So I'm going to add, like an ng-click directive, meaning that when I click on something, I can actually execute JavaScript within the quotes. So I have two ng-clicks, and then I have an ng-init to sort of initialize my counter. So if I just show you that quickly. Okay, so you can see that it's been initialized to 0. I haven't found any bugs today, so my counter happily can go up. And then when I don't find any bugs, I can just reset the counter. So very, very dumb logic. But unfortunately, it's in my view. So you can see here's my ng-init. And then it's wrapping, but here's my ng-click. So let's continue on. Let's say your designer came to you and said, what would be a great feature is that as more days go by, the background becomes more green to sort of make you feel happier. So I'll show you that working. So here, as I find more bugs, the background starts increasing and gets more green. So I feel a lot happier that days have gone by in which I don't have bugs. And the same functionality is still in there where, if a bug's found, I reset it. So as my counter goes up, this gets more green. And really, it's just an opacity thing, so it's nothing too complex there. But you can see that it's getting big enough that, my lines are starting to wrap, and I kind of don't like when my lines wrap because it kind of tells me something about having a little bit too much complex things in there, but, it actually does function. And I'm still working in this one file. And so, maybe they come back to you and say, can you change the color green because I really want it to be like more green. And you're like, oh, okay, so then I have to go back to my HTML view and like update it some more. But that's when you really stop, like seriously, like just don't go there. So what you want to do is like you want to organize your code into controllers. So you're going to keep your views very separated from your business logic. And so it's really easy to make an Angular controller. Essentially, you use the ng controller directive, and then you give your controller a name. And then within a script section, you use the same name. And if you have used Backbone, you might notice that in Backbone, you've had to extend things in order to actually say that it was a controller. But here it's really interesting because in Angular, you just say function, and you give it your controller name. And I'll talk about this scope a little bit more, but essentially now you have a controller. And all you have to do is know like some very simple JavaScript in order to do this. And so essentially, what happens is that when you apply this ng controller to an element, so it's on this div element, it takes that entire div and everything that's inside of it and binds it to your controller. So anything that you want to do in Magic Controller in here means that it's already kind of bound to all the stuff inside of your div. So here you can say I'm using a template expression here and also here. And I don't need this sort of scope parameter there. But when I want to use it in my controller, I have to use the scope. So like $scope period. It's sort of like this, if you've done other programming languages before, where instead of saying this dot, in Angular, when you're using a controller, it's scope dot. And that way, it sort of shields you away from all the weird stuff that JavaScript does, or especially ECMAScript, because scope is kind of weird in JavaScript. Like it's kind of confusing and a head scratcher. Actually, sorry. So then instead of putting all this logic into your view, you want to just get rid of it, and then you want to move it into your controllers. So here I decided to bootstrap this one div with all my sort of Angular stuff in it. I'm going to call it my counter controller. And then instead of having all this sort of logic in my click event, I can actually have it just call events or methods or functions in my controller. So I have an increment counter and reset counter. And I'll actually just show you the code because obviously I can't fit it all in my slides. So you can see that I just moved all that sort of logic into my controller. So it kind of really keeps my business logic separated from my views. So my view up here is pretty clean. Like if I had to give this to a designer, which is actually what Angular was meant for, is that when you want to work with a designer, it means that they can do all the hard work of laying out all the DOM stuff, working on colors, working on the CSS. It has very simple templating in order for them to sort of plug in a few things when they need to. And then as a developer, you can go and work in the background and start writing the complex stuff in a very separate file. And actually that leads to my next point. Is that in most cases, you probably don't want to have your script right on your page. You just want to externalize it into its own file. So I can just go ahead and grab all that stuff that used to be in that script. Where is it down here? So just use a script tag, point to this other file, and then within my other file, I just have all my controller stuff in there. So it keeps my files nice and simple. And you're going to notice that eventually you will have more controllers as your app gets bigger. And it's really nice just to have a file name that you can easily glance at and say, okay, this is the file for this functionality. And you're not trying to dig through this really long file looking for your functionality to update it. And I'll actually show it to you working too. So here's the new one where it's a little bit more green. It's supposed because you're more happy, because more bugs, no bugs have been found. And so now if you want to do even more complex things, you know that you don't have to touch your view. You can just go into your controller and add all your business logic there. And I will kind of make note that there's a newer syntax for working with controllers. In most cases, if you're really married to using this, like this dot instead of scope, you can go ahead and switch to this newer syntax. But if you're sort of newer to programming, you probably want to just stick with scope because most of the documentation will be written using scope dot. But essentially, it's the same directive ng controller, and instead of just passing in the word magic controller or the name of it, you can actually pass in an alias. And then you would use that alias whenever you're using your template expressions. And then within your controller, you don't have to pass in scope. You can just use this, and Angular just automatically knows what to bootstrap your controller to. And so those are really simple examples with, yeah?
What is the advantage of using that scope and base variable?
This one?
Yeah, what is the advantage of using analyze rather than using directly the control name?
There is actually, like, there's no speed performance at all. It's just a syntax change. Yes.
So could you have multiple controllers with different aliases? So using an alias, have a second controller?
Yeah, so if you have multiple controllers, I think the first thing, it's actually, so the interesting thing is that when you attach an ng controller to like a DOM element, and you actually, maybe you use it a few times on your page, they actually have their own scope. So they never collide on the page. They actually, if something's going on one controller, the other controllers have no idea about it. So using this actually doesn't affect how scope is used at all. Everything is very isolated when you use individual controllers. If you do want multiple controllers talking to each other, you do have to do some additional work where you might have a controller that controls your other controllers. So in that case, you might start using listeners. I'm going to cover a couple listeners later, but in most cases, when you're using a controller, it's very isolated. So it's nice because you don't have to worry about global variables leaking. It just keeps it very modular. So you can use controllers obviously for more complex things, and that's where you're going to end up doing where instead of having the string values, you can have arrays. So I might have an array of to-dos. And then in my template, I'm going to use this a directive called ng repeat, which is pretty awesome because you essentially say, for each of these to-dos, so for every to-do, I want you to just store it. So it's sort of like a for in loop, just like regular JavaScript. And so then you can use this to-do variable and start outputting it. And then this ng repeat, what it does is that it takes this entire line here and sort of like a rubber stamp, it takes it and duplicates it again. So for as long as you have to-dos, it's going to make a new list element. So it's a really cool sort of directive. Sorry, I don't have an example of that. It probably is in the doc, so let me see. That's not a very clear example. I think I should one a bit later, actually, so I'll come back to ng repeat. Or it's really great when you want to use objects. So a really good tip is that when you are making forms in Angular, instead of storing them into like individual sort of properties, make a master object and start storing your form elements into a single master object, because when it comes time to like start saving it to the database or something like that, you don't have to start massaging your data. You can just take that object directly and just pass it to your backend. So use an object when you need to sort of wrangle together more complex values. So the last sort of basic thing that I'll sort of cover is modules and dependency injection. So, I've kind of been harping that Angular is really great at creating very modular code. And so Angular modules are just object containers. Your top level module is sort of like an application namespace. That way when you're working on your application, people can tell that it's coming from your code and not some other third-party library. And essentially you're going to use modules to sort of store your controllers, your directives. There's other things called factories, services, filters. There's all these Angular things, but it's really nice just to keep it all nice and modular and self-contained. And the cool thing is that in Angular, everything's built around dependency injection. So you declare what is a dependency. And that sort of means that Angular will take sort of a list of dependencies and automatically bootstrap your application. And that's going to save you from having to manually sort of, initialize all your modules and declare it. So instead of having some sort of like main initialization script where you say init blah, 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 module, and init this one and set the state, you actually just use dependency injection to make sure that everything is self-contained. And Angular takes care of sort of bootstrapping everything together for you. And so to create a top-level application module, it's very simple. You use an ng app directive, and you tell it what you want your module, your top-level namespace to be. In this case, I'm going to say it's demo app. And then the syntax is super easy. You just say on the Angular object, you go angular.module. Use the same namespace, obviously. And then I'm going to talk a bit more about this. But then you pass in your dependencies as an array. And so then you can add other sort of like submodules to your main application. So angular.module, you're going to apply it to the same namespace, demo app. And then you use like .controller. So before I was showing you how I was just making this sort of function, and I just gave it a name, my controller name. Here's a little bit nicer because it means that just in case someone decided to also make their controller called magic controller, you're not going to collide. As long as you have this sort of namespace, it means that you can freely name your controllers and not have conflicts with third-party libraries. And also you would kind of put all this into its own file, and then you would include it as a script tag. And so note this like very subtle difference is that when you're creating a module or a top-level application namespace, you pass in an array. But when you want to retrieve it, say to store it or to configure it, like a .controller, you don't have this array. So it's a very subtle difference, so just keep that in mind as you're reading the code. And I'll just flip back to the previous slide just to kind of show you that, here you're declaring it, in here you're retrieving it and then applying another method on it. So you're just chaining together methods. So it's a very subtle difference. So when you have no dependencies, you just pass in an empty array. But let's say that you want to have a multi-page, or sort of more like a multi-view application, so like a single-page application that has routing. You might want to use what is already available called the routing module, which is ng-route. And then so you can just pass it in using strings. You can just pass it in as a dependency, and then the Angular framework will already know that you want to use it. At some point you're going to use it, and it will just know to bootstrap it for you. And so you don't have to worry about initializing this routing module. Angular will do it for you. And then when you have more modules that you want to bootstrap, then you just add it to the list. So here I can use ng-resource when I need to make HTTP requests, or ng-cookies to save and read cookies. And so then each of these modules should be in its own file. So you might see that you're going to have like a really big script sort of section. And when it comes time to building your application, you're going to go and take all these scripts, use a concatenation script, and just turn them all into like one minified file. So those are kind of like the basics. And actually, that kind of took me longer than I thought it would. So either I can recap or I can just take some questions before I move to part 2. Is there any questions? Yeah?
The dependency injection, would that replace
Yes, actually, so require.js you can use in conjunction, but in a lot of cases, I'll be hard pressed to, if your application is very Angular, then you probably won't need require.js. But if you, maybe it's like more of a legacy application where you have some stuff in require or not, you can use it in combination. I think I saw a question over here. Yes, yes you can. You can definitely combine them. Let's see. But actually, I was actually going to show a demo of how I was going to take jQuery out of the application, so I'll still show that actually. So in most cases when you're working with Angular, you might notice that you rely less on jQuery the more and more you sort of adopt this sort of like Zen, the model is the truth sort of methodology. So you'll find that you start not needing jQuery as much. But if you have a jQuery component, like say a drag and drop component, you can easily mix and match it. But you will notice that you start weaning yourself off jQuery the more you use Angular and start adopting how it approaches web development. Another question? Let's see. I don't think they support Internet Explorer 8 anymore, unfortunately. And anything higher is fine. So most modern browsers, I actually can't remember the list off the top of my head, but I do know that Angular 2.0 is going to be even more aggressive because it's going to require a lot more built-in browser functionality like mutation observers and object.observe. So that Angular 2.0 will definitely only support the browsers of the future. But I believe that if you really, really had to support Internet Explorer 8, you can get some polyfills to help sort of get you up and going with IE8. But I don't remember the exact cutoff for that. Any other questions? Yeah? TypeScript? I'm not too familiar with TypeScript actually, so I don't think I can answer that question for you. Sorry. Anything else? Okay, so I will actually show, this sort of thing that I was going to do where I wrote this like really quick demo for an HTML5 rocks article where I initially wrote it in jQuery, but then I kept on looking at the code and it was kind of irritating me how it kept on manipulating the DOM. So it's a really simple application where it's not Gmail, it's fake Gmail, where you press send and it's going to make 2 fake requests and then sort of time out. And it's really easy flow where you click, there's a submit handler, it's going to try to submit the data using a jQuery post. And if it fails less than 3 times, it's just going to try resubmitting twice. And when it does fail the 3rd time, it's just going to show you an error. So it's a really stupid, simple app. And so I'm just going to do like a quick comparison of the code. I considered actually rewriting this application live, but then it just took too long, and I was like, no one wants to watch me type for that long. So, okay, so I have Kaleidoscope open here, which is just a diff tool on Mac. And so on the left-hand side here, I have my jQuery application, and on my right-hand side here, I have my Angular application. So you can see that, on the Angular application, I have to add a body tag. And this is actually a good sort of like a recap, is that, on the body, you add, you bootstrap your Angular application using ng-app. You put all your business logic into a controller. So I said, everything in this demo div, use my mail controller. And then some subtle differences is that I can use directives like ng disable to sort of control state of my app, of my buttons. I can use ng show to sort of say like when something should be showing and when something shouldn't be showing. There's the typical binding expression. So instead of having sort of some like a span where I have to put a class or an ID in order to sort of latch onto it, I don't have to do that with Angular. It's just straight up template expressions. I have ng clicks in order to call methods in my controller. And then obviously instead of jQuery, I use Angular. So by the end of this, I actually completely got rid of jQuery completely. In terms of styles, there were 2 display nones that I didn't have to worry about anymore. So it was in the jQuery version, but Angular is going to take care of when things are going to show and when things are going to hide. So I actually don't want it in my Angular application style sheets. And so obviously the big difference is going to be in the JavaScript. And that's a really great thing about having Angular is because, or even like having a really clean application, as you can see that I can switch from an entire framework. My view doesn't change very much, so my HTML didn't change very much, but it's my business logic that does. And so in order to take something that was once in jQuery, which is on the left here, and turn it into something in Angular, it required, instead of having a simple closure, JavaScript closure, now it's going to be an Angular controller. I turn all the variables into, I sort of Anglified it, where I use scope dot on all my variables. And the big notice you're going to see is that, typically in most applications, when you're doing jQuery, like good practice is that you declare all your DOM stuff at the top, so that way later on when you're sort of doing JavaScript things to it, you're not playing around with DOM, like looking at DOM stuff in more of your business logic section. You kind of know that when you have to work with your designer that when there's something in the DOM that you need to know about, you declare all that stuff at the top. And the biggest difference is that it disappears in Angular. Like you don't actually have to know anything about the DOM. It's actually pretty ignorant of what your view actually is. So there is absolutely 0 DOM lookups in your Angular controllers. And instead you use variables like is retrying, and it's a Boolean, whether it's true or false, or is failed, or is sending. So instead you're going to use your model, these variables, in order to control state of your DOM. You never have to do anything, look up your DOM and then do something to it. Let's see, another biggest difference, let's see if I can find it here. I think it was sort of how I was mentioning where, here I'm in the failed section where now I need to show someone an error message. Instead of doing DOM things here, I just say, is it retrying? I set it to false. Has it failed? I set it to true. And I set is sending to false. So I'm just playing around with the model. I'm playing around with the true source of, when I say like the model is the true source of truth, you can see that I'm just updating Boolean values here, where previously in a jQuery, I would actually have to know quite a bit about the DOM in order to do something with it. So I would have to know that I have a retry message object somewhere that I should hide or show. And all that sort of disappears when you start using Angular. And so I think when I look at the code afterwards, so let me just see if I can pull up scripts here. So this is the jQuery version. And I found that, when I just read it, I have to know a little bit of context. So I kind of need to know why someone is doing these shows. Why are you showing it? Do I actually know why you're showing it? So then you kind of have to comment your code a lot more. But when you kind of look at the Angular version, because everything's about the true source of data is, the model, that everything is based around just reading what your model state is. So is retrying, is failed, is sending, nothing about DOM in here. I don't have to worry about that. I just know that in my view, Angular is going to take care of making sure that my view is updated. So it makes for a lot cleaner code, and it's much easier to read without comments. And I know we're lazy; we never comment our code, right? So it's better to have self-documenting code. So I think the biggest benefit of switching from jQuery to Angular is that everything is about being model-driven. So you have a descriptive state variables, and so your code is better at self-documenting. You have less code needed for DOM manipulation. And your business logic is completely decoupled from the view. So you could completely change the view, and it doesn't matter because really you're going to use a model to help figure out what your view should be. And it's more clear when you read the HTML. So this makes it really good to be working with a designer or a copywriter, and they don't have to worry about the business logic. They can just worry about what needs to be on that page. So, the model is the truth, and that's the biggest thing that I took away when I switched to Angular was that it was never really that apparent to me when I was using other MVC frameworks, but when I started using Angular and really feeling the zen of Angular, that's when like this started really kicking in. And I find that if I ever feel lost in terms of what I should be doing with my Angular code, like how I should organize it, I think about this, and then things become clear. So it's, I don't know, it's just weird and trippy. So, okay, so let's see, I don't have that much time left actually. So let's see, let's go about tools. There's Batarang, Yeoman, some testing tools, and text editor plugins. So let's just talk kind of quickly about Batarang. So I think the Angular team like hangs out together and they kind of come up with these like names that have angles in them. So Batarang is the boomerang that Batman carries around. So that's where that name came from. So it's a Chrome extension. So you get this from the Chrome store. Just go to the Chrome store, search for Batarang. And once you install it, what you're going to get is another panel in your dev tools. So when you inspect your elements, and then this console pulls up. Let me just make it bigger. You're going to see that there's a new tab now. Previously, it would stop at console, but now there's an AngularJS tab. There's a little bit of instructions of like what is in this sort of extension, but essentially you have to enable it. Most of the time, you have to enable it every time you refresh the browser or go to a new page. Because for the debugger to run, it actually does take, consumes a bit of processing power. But here you can kind of go around and let me just go to a simpler page to look at because this is the Angular website and it's a bit complex. How about this one? So inspect element, hop over to the Angular tab, and you can see that I have two scopes in here. So I can just click around and I can kind of figure out what's my model for that scope. So this is a good way for debugging to figure out if your application is behaving or not. There are other options for checking your performance. So when things, let's see if I can let me pop this down to the bottom here. All right, so when I click on this button, I actually don't think there's any watch expressions. No, this one's not a very good one. I'll show it, if I remember, I'll show you this performance tag on a tab on a different one. But the one kind of key thing that I point to is that I'm like this huge console.log person, which is kind of bad. I actually really should be doing some more efficient ways of debugging, but I love doing console.log when I'm in a pickle. So it might confuse you because, let's zoom in here. If I'm here just in an application, scope is not defined. So you're like, oh, how am I going to debug this application when I can't get into scope? But with Batarang, what you can actually do is that if you know that something has an Angular sort of controller or an app on it, you have to sort of select it from your elements pane. So if I am here and I highlighted HTML, and I just went to my console, sorry, this is like giant, and I typed scope, it's undefined. So as a tip, when you do need to debug scope, you need to find something that has Angular in it. So in this case, here's a container, and there's a bit of a scope on there. You can see that because there's a Angular adds this ng scope directive to things that it's watching. So let me go back to console. And now when I type scope, knowing that it's selected in my elements pane, I'm going to have some more information there. So that will confuse you the first time you open up Batarang, but do know that you do have to have that particular DOM element selected in your elements pane. Okay, so this is actually my favorite tool for Angular, is Yeoman. Is there anyone here who uses Yeoman in their other projects? No, okay, awesome. This is like my favorite, absolute favorite tool. Okay, let me just click out of this server. All right, so I actually helped edit the code lab for this. So if you go to yeoman.io, in the sidebar, there's an option to go to the code lab. And we actually use AngularJS as the first demo app that you do. So you kind of learn from beginning to end, like how to install how to install Yeoman, how to install the Angular generator, and make a little kind of tiny to-do application, all using sort of Angular as the MVC framework. So that's kind of a 1 hour code lab that we can kind of run through. But essentially, all this is based in the command line. So Yeoman is a command line tool that helps you get rid of all these tedious things that you would normally do when you're building a web application. And so to get Angular installed, it uses Node and Node Package Manager to install packages from the Node Package Manager. So from your command line, I already have it installed, but from your command line, kind of anywhere you are, you go npm install -g for global, or you can go -- global, and you say yo. It used to actually be Yeoman, but that's like the previous version, so now it's actually just yo. So we need, and actually I need to sudo this. Let me do this again. Just to give myself permissions, my computer permission. So it's kind of nice. Whenever I actually see all these things fly by in my terminal, I'm always like, oh, I'm so productive because with this one line, my computer's just doing so much work for me. But essentially, like Yeoman just updated and installed using npm. So now from anywhere, I can say yo, and it pulls up this kind of like little sort of like very ASCII reminiscent like kind of selector here. And so you can kind of do a few things from here. You can go and maybe like look for the Angular, like do a search and like look for Angular and see what else is available for you to install. So you can kind of see that people have gone out and created Angular Bootstrap libraries. I don't even know what some of these are. Cordova. I don't even know what some of these are. So that's kind of the awesome thing about open source is that there's just so much stuff going on. Control C to get out of here. And so from Yo, you can do all these kind of cool things. The code lab kind of goes over a bit more, but essentially it's going to make all the things that you find tedious a lot better. And all of it's based in the command line, so you kind of just type commands into the command line, and then you just feel like productive, and then you go for a beer, and then you tell your boss that you actually spent a week on something, but it actually took you 1 line. So once you have Yeoman installed, you can actually install the generator for Angular. This actually takes a bit longer because there's all these dependencies. But I can actually go in here at npm install, and I can install this globally. And it's called Angular. I think it's actually called Yeoman Angular. What did I use? Generator Angular, sorry. And so this is just going to go to the Node package, repository, pull down all the things related to things I need to get up and started with an Angular application. So this takes a bit longer to do, depending on your internet. So let me just switch back while that does things. And so essentially, once you have a generator, which essentially means that it's sort of like a seed project. So whenever you want to get up and started right away with an Angular application, instead of manually setting up your controllers and all your file structure, you can use these generators to automatically scaffold out your project. So it's going to create HTML files for you. It will create script folders for you. It will create tests for you. So it's really awesome because it helps take away all these tedious things that you tend to do on a day-to-day basis. So you have to install it, which, okay, there you go. And so at any point, you can run yo, well, you make a folder, and then you run yo Angular, and then you give it some sort of app name. So I'm actually going to switch out of this directory because it will collide with something I already have in there. I made a little folder for live, so here I can actually say yo Angular, give it an app name, DevWeek app. And then it's going to give you sort of a not really WYSIWYG, I don't know what you call this, a panel of questions, where it's like, do you want to use this with Compass, which is kind of a nice syntax for CSS. I like using Compass, so I'm going to say yes. So then you can kind of go, do I want to use Twitter Bootstrap? And I can say yes. So it kind of asks you all these questions in order to figure out like the best way to scaffold out your app. I can kind of say that, I'm using my spacebar here, which modules that I want to include. I'm going to say that I don't want any, so I'm just going to leave that as blank. And then I can actually just run this. And it just, goes off into the internet, so you have to be online for this. It goes off in the internet, starts finding all these modules for you, and starts building out your project for you. So this takes a couple minutes, not too long, but I did already run this on earlier. So it made this entire directory contents for me. So it used to be empty, but essentially made all these files in here where there's, it's built quite a lot on something called Grunt. So if you never used Yeoman, you may not have heard of Grunt, but Grunt's kind of awesome because it automates everything in your dev life. So you can create some configuration files for that. Yeoman takes care of building out that file for you. And then if you go into the app directory, you can kind of see that it sort of built out your application for you. So there's an index file using HTML file boilerplate, which is sort of a best practice way, and gives you sort of all these includes already, gives you 404 pages. It gives you your first main HTML view. It gives you your main application script. It already makes a controller folder for you and makes your first sort of controller for you. So it does all of that using this like one line. So you can just see it took a couple minutes to do that. But now that that's already done, I can use Grunt, which is an automation tool, and I can actually say, as I'm developing, I can say, serve up this directory to me, and it's going to automatically go and run some tasks on it, launch it up, and then suddenly I already have my first Angular application, and it only takes 5 minutes to have your first application from start to beginning. And so this entire application is built on Angular. I don't think these buttons work, no. But it's kind of cool, because if you notice this stuff down here, this HTML here, actually they kind of changed it. It used to be driven by this array. So you can see that there's an array here of awesome things. And in the controller, so that is the controller. In my view, in my main view here, I'm just going to erase actually everything in here. And I can actually just use ul, and I'll show you the ng repeat. Let's see. So ng-repeat. And I can say for tools and awesome things. I'm writing this quickly, so I hope I'm getting this right. Oops. How lied. I should just get a list of all the tools now. What was that? Thank you very much. Awesome things. Oh, I'm actually working in the wrong directory right now. So I was actually working in the one that I already built out. So let me go over to the live one that I just did. Where's my view? So I'm going to just copy this view back in over to my app views. Let me replace that one. Hey. I actually just broke it. Where are they even working? Serve. I don't know what happened here. All right, bad demo, sorry. I actually don't know what went on there, so that's okay. Actually, I do know what went on, but I will continue actually. Okay, so the nice thing about this Angular Yeoman connection is that it has all these tools now, these command line tools for you to create your controllers right away, create views, create routes, and all using this one line. And it takes care of doing all these other like little tedious things. So say you want to make a new controller. Let's go back into terminal. I'm going to exit out of here using Control C. And here I can actually go yo Angular. I can say that I want it to make a controller for me, and I want it to be new controller. And you can see that it tells me that it made 2 new files for me: new controller.js and controllers, scripts controllers, and another one in a test folder. And if I kind of look here in my HTML, you can actually see that I didn't have to go in here and insert a reference to the new controller in here. It just kind of automatically updated my HTML for me. And the really nice thing too is that if I, instead of just wanting a controller, and I wanted to do a route, which is actually 2 files, it's a view and a controller. I'm going to call this like date picker. It's going to actually do like more work for me. Things that would have been kind of tedious is that it actually created, 2 JavaScript files in my scripts and in my test folder. And it also created an HTML file for me. So now when I kind of go in here, see in my scripts, you can see that in controllers, it just made a date picker file for me. And there's my new controller. And if I look in my views, you can also see that there's also a datepicker.html in there. And then my HTML automatically just updated to include this new JavaScript file. And if I was looking at my application, I didn't get into routing, but if I looked at my my app.js, which is my main application file, it automatically added this routing for me, date picker. So it's kind of nice. It does all these like things for you that would be kind of like, it shaves off a lot of time in terms of your day-to-day development. So I use Angular and Yeoman together almost for most of my applications. And you can use these commands for almost all of your files that you need to create. It's nice because, probably I can get into testing because my time is almost up. But the nice thing too is that if you use testing tools, you can just run grunt test, and it's automatically going to go and figure out if your unit tests are failing or not. And because the Yeoman generator already creates these test files for you, there's really no excuse for you like not to write unit tests because most of it's sort of created for you. So kind of if I pop my over back over here, I'm going to actually go into pre-install. You can see down here there's a test folder. It already kind of like scaffolds out all of your unit tests for you, so then you can quickly get up and running with unit testing. And then when you're ready to release, you just run grunt build. So if I hop in back to the command line and just run grunt build, it does all this work around concatenating all of your JavaScript files. So as you have multiple controllers, it's just going to concatenate and minify it into one single JavaScript file. It's going to run unit tests for you. And anything that you can kind of think of that you might do on a day-to-day basis when you're deploying your application, like optimizing your images, Grunt can kind of do that for you. You just have to get some plugins for it, write a couple configurations, and Grunt will kind of help deal with all that. So you never have to let best practices go to waste because you can use grunt to make sure that you're reinforcing it with your team. And so then from there, it essentially makes a distribution folder for you. Not that one, on min. Sorry, for some reason my live one is not working very well, but let me go back up to my pre-installed one. And so there's a distribution folder here. And if I kind of look at the index file, you can see that it's been minified. All my scripts, instead of having all these controllers in here, it's actually been minified into like this one file. So that's really nice for saving speed in terms of HTTP requests. So I'm actually at time. I'm surprised because I thought it would be short of time. I'm going to talk about testing and a few other things. So I guess if you want to stay, I'm in the last session, so if you want to stay, I can keep on rambling. Raise your hand if you want me to keep on rambling. I have like 15 more minutes. Okay, so if you have to leave, go ahead and like leave. I won't be offended. Okay, testing. So this is something I'm actually really bad at because as a developer, you kind of, you need to get into the habit of doing testing. But Angular was built around test-driven development. So it's really easy to write unit tests because there's all this tooling around it. So one of the tools is called Karma. And this is a test runner. And it was built by someone on the Angular team. And there's another tool called Jasmine. And this is from Pivotal Labs. And this is a unit tester for JavaScript. So when you combine them together, you use your Karma test runner to run your JavaScript tests in browser. So Angular is very much built around DOM manipulation, where Jasmine is actually for running your unit tests outside of the browser. So when you kind of combine these two, you use Jasmine to describe your tests, and then you use Karma to actually run your tests in a real browser. And so you can do very descriptive ways of describing your test by saying, and you kind of describe what should be happening, and you assign a callback, and you use the expect to figure out, like, is this actually happening? And if it is happening, if you expect your array length to be 3, your unit test will pass. And if they aren't, then you're going to get a fail. And so the cool thing I was kind of showing you is that Yeoman actually the generator automatically makes these unit tests for you, so it's already kind of scaffolded out for you. So there's really no excuse to avoid writing unit tests. So when you're using Yeoman, you can actually use grunt test, and it's just going to run through all of your unit tests and give you a pass or fail. So you can have this running during your day-to-day work because it's just going to watch your files, and if something happens, you break your code by accident, your terminal is going to flash at you and then give you a bit of an update to say, hey, you should go look at this code, you might have broken something. Or you can incorporate it into, I see what's happening. Let me switch into actually this other one. Let me go back into pre-install. Grunt test. So you can actually even incorporate all of your unit tests into continuous integration. So you can do something where your teammates checks in something into Git, you got some scripts running, and then it will automatically run your unit tests for you, and if they pass, it will automatically push it to your server. So it's a really great way of doing continuous integration. And so you can see here that successfully my tests have passed, but if I do and go in here and change what I expected to happen, so I need to go into pre-install, main. Let's say I added in something here. So now my array is actually 4. I expect it to be 3. So my test should fail at this point. So you can see that there's a bit of a fail. So obviously you would do this with more complex things. You can do it with simple things and complex things. But it's always good just to have your unit tests because it's going to save you from doing those small typos or doing things that another developer expected you to adhere to, but then you like didn't realize it. So that's kind of what unit tests are really great for. There's another testing tool that's fairly new, so there's not a lot of there is some information on it, but it's still fairly new, like 3 months old, called Protractor. And this is to do your end-to-end testing. So you use Karma and Jasmine for your more behavioral testing in terms of making sure that your filters are working correctly. So like when you're doing math on something, to make sure that you're actually doing your arithmetic correctly. Where end-to-end testing is more about testing things in the browser as if a user was using your web app. So sort of like pretending to be a mouse, sort of like pretending to click a mouse or click a button. And so if you've ever used something called Selenium WebDriver or Selenium, it's this way that you kind of have like this ghost that opens up a browser and it clicks on things that you tell it to click on, and it'll sort of tell you if the behavior after that click was expected or not. So Protractor is just a wrapper for a Selenium WebDriver, so you can open up your functional tests in Chrome, or Safari, or a mobile browser. And so you also use Jasmine to describe your tests. And so it takes a bit more time to get installed because Selenium WebDriver takes a bit longer to install. And it's fairly new, so it's not part of the Yeoman generators yet. But you can expect to hear a lot more about Protractor as the Angular team moves forward with it. Very quickly, I won't describe this, but for any of your text editors, you're probably going to find an Angular plugin, which will autofill all your directives and controllers for you. If you're using any of these ones that are kind of on the website, like WebStorm, Sublime, or Visual Studio, there's links to it from the Angular docs. And so that's all for tools. Are there any questions about tools? No? Okay. So I probably shouldn't bore you with part 3 then, right? Okay, do you guys raise your hand if you want me to keep on rambling some more? Okay. You guys are a very captive audience. So I hope you go home after this and make an Angular app using Yeoman, because it's pretty easy. So I kept this part pretty light. I just wanted to touch base on custom directives and watch and apply. So custom directives, there's tons of directives that are already available to you, built into Angular. You know, ng-show, you can polyfill forms, and then you can use it as class attributes. But when you want to write your own custom directive, you want to do this when you have a complex piece of DOM that has some behavior to it, so you want to encapsulate it. So that way, when you work with someone else on your team, they don't have to worry about the nitty-gritty of it. They just know that they can use your date picker or your calendar widget, and they don't have to worry about all the details. And so when you look at this slide, it seems really simple what you need to do to make a directive. Like you have your top-level module defined, so your namespace. Then you use .directive. You give actually I screwed up here, and it actually should be camel case on this one. Because it's always camel case in JavaScript. And then you return an initialization object for your directive. So looks very simple here, right? And then you realize, holy crap, there's all these things that you need to initialize. So there's quite a few things, and as you're learning to write directives, you'll just have the documentation open in one tab, and you'll flip back and forth to it. But these are kind of all the options that you have to define your directive object. Here's like a little table. But essentially, here's my top 4 properties that you probably want to deal with when you first make your directive. There's the restrict property. Template is pretty self-explanatory because essentially, when you make a directive, like the first step probably would be that you would write it in your HTML file and realize it's getting complex. And so then you would move all that HTML into your JavaScript. If you have fairly complex templates, you can always use external HTML files that are sort of fragments or partials. There are 2 sort of return functions that are in directives, link and compile. Link is the one that you will use 99.9% of the time. But essentially, you're doing all your scope type things here. So sort of if you remember in the controller, we were doing like scope dot something something, scope arrays and whatever. You would use this link function for the same thing. So doing all your business logic. And then there's the last one, which is slightly confusing, is scope. So I was kind of talking earlier about how when you're using a directive on a page, they're very isolated. So if you have a date picker, it's a very encapsulated date picker. It only knows about itself. But when you need to do more complex things like inherit from its parent or know about global variables and objects, then you have to know a little bit about the scope property. So in terms of restricting, if you want to make a directive that's just a tag, an HTML tag, you use the A for attribute. If you're using a custom HTML element, you use E for element. If you have a directive that's on a class, you can use C. And if you have like this weird one that's an HTML comment, you can use M. I don't know where M comes from. I guess they just ran out of letters. And in terms of scope, you can either use I'm going to show you some examples of this with a bigger application. You can use either this equality equal signs to bind to a property in a parent scope. So I'll show you that. You can pass in things as a string, so it's not an object, you just need like a simple value. Or you can bind to like callback functions using the ampersand. So I'm just going to show you some examples with the equal signs. There's sort of two applications that I've done. I've done designresearchtechniques.com, which is an Angular application. You kind of see that actually. I'm still working on it, so it still has like the Yeoman fab icon on here. And then also I worked on this sort of, oops, let me go back to here. This sort of infographic that I did at TELUS, where I just took all the devices that we have that we sell and sort of broke it down into the screen size. So I have this kind of like nice data viz of all the screen sizes that we sell. And so here's like a Galaxy S3 is 720 by 1280. This is probably like a Nexus. No, that's an iPad. People browse TELUS.com on a PlayStation. Quite a lot of people, actually. It's kind of weird. And over here is probably a BlackBerry. No, that's an LG Optimus chat. Here's a BlackBerry. So it's kind of this kind of Angular application that was very quick. Like it was just like a 1 week app that I built that uses a bit of filtering. So when I switch views, then I get different sort of display of how my cards lay out. I can filter by, which one of these are Windows. So here's like all the Windows devices that we get traffic from. So it's a very simple app. And this one I did actually put the source code up for. Design Research Techniques is not up, but you can actually get all the source code from GitHub. Where's my slides here? Okay, so let me just poke around on some of the code for that one. So these stats. So if you look at my main HTML file, I'm using ngView, meaning that it's going to be like a multi-page application. And in my main view, I actually have two. I have a view that's in English and one that's in French. So it's kind of nice that I can actually use URL routing here to say that if someone's going to the English site, serve up the English version. If someone's in the French site, serve up the French version. But in my main view, you can see that to do all that data visualization, I made a custom directive called TELUS Resolution Viz. And so it's a really good habit that if you are building an application and you're making your own custom directives, namespace your namespace your directives using like your company name or something unique to your application. And that way, it's very clear that it's code that you wrote and not code that you got from a third-party library. And so if I look at this TELUS resolution viz, I made a directive for it here. And so here you can see that I restrict it to elements, so I want to only catch on to markup that looks like this, where it's an actual HTML element. If there was anything inside of it, so if someone wrote garbage in here like this, I can actually say replace and get rid of all that. It's not a top priority, like a must-know property on my top 4 list, but it's there. And you can see here that my template I kept in the page, so you can just put all your HTML in here. Scope is actually set to true, so there's nothing complex in there. But you can see that I also used a controller callback, and there should be a link one down here, link. So anytime that you're doing some sort of like business logic, you can just throw it in there. Controllers for something a bit more complex. It's more like when you're creating an API-based directive. You can see that this is actually could even be shrunken down into something a bit more cleaner. But you can see that it keeps your view very clean. But you put all your business logic into this directive. Controller, in terms of directives, controllers actually, when you see it, let's see, which file did I have open? I had a resolution viz open. So controllers are for, like, in terms of directives, this controller here, so not to be confused by like the other controllers that we were making, but this controller here means that any of these properties or methods can be made public to other directives to use. So I have this one like get scaled unit, reset selected card, where the reason why I have these here in my controller is because I have another directive where inside of this resolution viz, which is kind of keeping track of like overall state for me, I can actually insert child directives in here. So here's a child directive, and I can pass things into it. And that's what generates all these little cards. From resolution card, if I looked up reset, what did I call it? Like reset selected card, and I looked it up here. No, actually I don't use it there, I use it somewhere else. Let's see, get scaled unit. So from like a child element, I can use the controller to speak to expose APIs. So that's kind of what you would use controller for in terms of directives. But in most cases, when everything is very encapsulated and you're just doing your own directive, you tend to just use the link function or the callback to do most of your logic. Did that answer your question? All right, I'm going to wrap up because I can see that everyone's fading. I'm not going to cover this. Everyone's fading. So I will post these slides though. And all of my code is up on GitHub. That's already up to date. So feel free to like poke around any of the demos from earlier in the slides. So thank you so much for sticking it out for me. Like they said 90 minutes, and I was like, oh, that's too long. So obviously I love Angular enough that I can talk about it for hours. So thank you so much for sticking around, and hopefully I'll catch you around the rest of the sessions. I also am talking about the work I was doing at TELUS tomorrow. I can't remember what room I'm in, but I will be same time slot, just tomorrow somewhere else. So feel free to come to that one. It's more process-based, less technical. So thank you so much.